Many people came away from Undertale with the impression that it expresses a warped sense of morality because of an expectation of the player to spare all enemies. When taken at face value, the game's morals are a bit dubious, asking the player to prioritize the lives of characters who are trying to murder them over guaranteeing their own safety by fighting. But there are a few important factors to consider that make this less clear-cut than it first appears. We could start with the fact that not every enemy is trying to kill you. Some enemies are pretty much harmless. In fact, there are a few that can't kill you no matter how hard you try to make it happen. There's not much reason to kill such enemies, if they can even be called enemies. Some enemies harm you in spite of their intentions. That's a bit of a gray area, but let's put all this aside and look at a case such as Undyne. None of those factors apply to her. It would seem to be a pretty clear-cut case of self-defense if the player kills her. She's not only dangerous, but fully cognizant of her actions, and has no reservations against killing you despite you having done nothing but try to escape the underground. So why would the game take you to task for killing her of all people? I contend that the game is not quite as judgmental towards the player as some people have said. The neutral endings aren't necessarily bad. Now, things don't go as well as they possibly could, but that's not the game cheating you or anything. You know, not everyone is going to get the happy ending when some of them are dead. That's just the way things go. Even so, the neutral endings might as well be called the good or decent endings in many cases. You have to keep in mind, to get the true pacifist ending, you basically have to take on the role of Messiah in this story. Killing the monsters for the sake of your own safety is perfectly understandable, and it's not something I'd call evil. But when done while alternative options are available, self-defense killing doesn't really fit the bill for Messiah. You kind of have to go above and beyond for that. If you want to be the eternal savior of monsters, you have to be willing to protect other lives at risk of your own, and that seems perfectly fair to me. On top of that, sparing enemies really isn't that hard, and the game doesn't tear into you that much unless you go out of your way to kill everything you see. I won't deny that the game is preachy when it comes to some of the messaging, but the point it gets across is not as bad as it might seem at first glance. Maybe I'm rationalizing a bit, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. Because whether you agree with me up to this point or not, we have to look at the bigger picture. Trying to assess the morality of self-defense in Undertale is a topic that goes far beyond asking whether this monster or that deserved to die, or whether the player has any responsibility to protect those monsters. We have to remember that the player benefits from determination. Remember, the player isn't just some weird-looking kid, nor a mysterious heart driving that weird-looking kid. There's something more. The player is effectively immortal because of the ability to reset. That's one of the interesting things about Undertale, how it uniquely handles a concept nearly ubiquitous in games: death. Since death is so common in video games, when one of them puts an interesting spin on how it handles the player dying, such as by weaving it into the narrative, well, that's something that sticks out to me. So in the case of Undertale, respawning at the last checkpoint, as it were, is canon. This is not only pertinent to the focus of this video, but it's, to me, the most interesting thing about the game. The player's unique ability to reset is a major factor in the game's story. It's not the first game I've played where this is the case, but it does explore the implications of this in a way I've never seen, and it leaves a few open questions for us to think about. Every battle you are faced with can only end in your victory one way or another. You can die, yes, but that really just means trying again. You just cast the dice enough times and you'll eventually get the outcome you want. And so the only requirement to achieve anything you want is the determination, if you will, to persevere and hit continue so many times. There are some caveats, of course. You might be made to restart the whole game, but you get my point. There's not a true failure state in most games that isn't easily reverted when you die. When you think about it, the only thing that's actually special about the player in a lot of video games is your ability to turn back time whenever things don't go your way. Undertale is different from the norm in that it openly acknowledges this. For once, all these deaths aren't just something you're not supposed to think about, and even though it's brought up to mock you at times, it's there to reinforce the player's connection to the game, rather than roll the curtains and announce a retake of the previous scene over and over. There are other implications of resetting in Undertale, like being able to undo the deaths of NPCs, which the game also accounts for, but no doubt the greatest benefit is how you are able to continue after dying. Your victory is thereby inevitable, as long as you're interested in the game. I loved the moment where Sans acknowledges this fact at the end of a genocide run and purposely decides to make the experience frustrating, rather than purely trying to win the fight in a conventional sort of way. And that's because he's aware you can keep trying, but he just wants you to give up. Undertale is one of the few games where something as basic as resetting the game is actually treated with some kind of reverence, and why shouldn't it be? It's the ultimate superpower if you think about it, and one that pretty much every video game protagonist has, and it's not to be taken for granted. That's not to say that every game needs to do all this meta stuff, but I appreciate when it does happen, because it opens up a lot of doors for interesting conversations about video games as a medium. This ties into our original question of whether killing the characters is justifiable within the perspective of the game. When you factor in how the player is essentially some higher power for which death is merely an inconvenience, things are so far removed from the judgment that would go into a real-world conversation that it's hard to make a definitive argument that killing a character like Undyne constitutes valid self-defense. Why should an entity that cannot be killed be entitled to self-defense? There is no split-second decision to make, no stress of not knowing what will happen if you don't pull the trigger or anything like that. This question extends beyond Undertale. Can the concept of self-defense as we know it reasonably be applied to any game at all when they present you with any other option? And for the record, I'm not delusional, and I can tell fiction from reality. I do not think you are evil if you do things besides pure pacifist runs in your video games. Full disclosure, this is all for the sake of argument. And from that standpoint, if you acknowledge that the game resets when you die, have you really earned the best possible outcome when you kill a character who can be dealt with through less violent means? Perhaps not.